Friends, sometimes what we need to do is to go back and re-watch, reread, or re-listen. And that is what we are going to do in this episode of Be Worth Following. Last year, we had the opportunity to have Mark Miller of Chick-fil-A be a part of our podcast. And he had so many wonderful, wise, actionable things to say. Chick-fil-A is known globally for its ability to grow and develop leaders, and it is not surprising at all when you get a chance to hear from Mark Miller. One of the things that he's going to share is what he thinks about when he walks into a room as a leader. What is his perspective? And it is so simple and so wise and cuts through all the clutter of 100 different methodologies and puts it in such simple and clear terms. I am excited to have us go through this again. So, for this week's episode of Be Worth Following, we are going to revisit from last year our conversation with the one and only Mark Miller.
One of the very practical and extremely tactical activities that I personally practice, and I've been encouraging leaders for decades to do this, I said, what would happen if you attempted to add value to every person you encounter? If I'm trying to add value to you, who am I thinking about? Well, I'm now thinking about you. I'm not thinking about me. So my focus has already shifted. And there are countless ways to add value to people. But what changes you is not your success rate. What changes you is your effort. It's the trying that transforms.
It's a little surprising to hear that merely trying to be an others-focused leader can transform us in that direction. But when the logic is solid and the message comes from a world-class developer of leaders, well, in that case, we should all pay attention. I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Mark Miller, Vice President of High Performance Leadership at Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is one of the most beloved and successful restaurant chains in the United States. Their business model and perspectives on leadership are unique, and those unique perspectives are producing uniquely positive results. Over the last 5 years, Chick-fil-A has grown from $9 billion to almost $20 billion in revenue, and that is not nearly the most interesting financial metric about Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A stores are famously open only 6 days a week, and in those 6 days, they produce more revenue per store than McDonald's, Starbucks, and Subway combined. And all of those restaurants are open 7 days a week. Mark Miller is responsible for crafting the thinking, development, and culture of the leaders who are producing those kind of results. But Mark's accolades don't stop at the door of Chick-fil-A. He is a sought-after speaker, as well as an author of 10 books on leadership, culture, and performance. Mark was just the 16th corporate employee ever hired at Chick-fil-A, which put him in direct contact for 30 years with Chick-fil-A's founder, Truett Cathy. But even before Truett Cathy began influencing Mark, a couple of other important people were influencing his development. And that is where we begin.
I feel so fortunate to have had many, many leaders who have influenced me. I think that's part of the advantage of living a long time. A lot of women and men have spoken into my life and leadership. I think I'd have to go all the way back and start with my mom. She's the one that convinced me that I should never quit until I'm finished. And she pointed out some times in my early life when she felt like I quit before I finished. And I think that marked me. So she was certainly an early influence. My first real supervisor convinced me that your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. I think that was a defining moment in my life and leadership. Prior to that, I had not made a commitment to lifelong learning. My parents wished that I had done that much earlier because I was a lousy student. But I said, okay, if that's how the world works, if you want more influence, you want more opportunity, you want more responsibility, you've got to make a commitment to lifelong learning.
Had you heard anything similar to that earlier in life, but it just landed with your first supervisor?
It's the first time I really heard it. Now,
Okay.
keep in mind, I was 19 years old. So, I mean, maybe somebody told me that as a kid, but again, I was a lousy student because I really just didn't apply myself. But once I understood that that's how the world works, I said, okay, I can do that. I mean, people often ask, how does that manifest itself? I said, well, I'd love to listen to the radio in the car, but I'll listen to a audible book or a podcast instead. Even 40 plus years, I'm still having to make those conscious decisions because learner is not at the top of my strength finders. Let's put it that way. And let me give you one more. I had the privilege to be hired by Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A. And he taught me so much. I mean, we worked together for, I guess, 30 years before he passed away, and over 30 years. And he really taught me so much about generosity. And I don't remember him ever talking to me about generosity, but I had a front row seat at what a generous life looks like. And that marked me as well.
Connect that to leadership if you could, because I imagine some people are listening and they're like, okay, generosity, that's a good character quality to have. But really, what does that have to do with being an effective leader?
Well, I think the most important character trait for an effective servant leader is the ability to think others first. And if you don't have an abundance mentality, if you don't have a generous spirit, and you may not have that naturally, I think it's a cultivated and developed character trait, the ability to think others first, you'll never reach your full potential as a leader. The question that we encourage leaders to ask often is, am I a serving leader or a self-serving leader? Because your motives matter far more than you can imagine.
You know, that matches up perfectly with some research that we have been able to be a part of. What we accidentally found, Mark, is that 77% of leadership is a function of who you are, not what you do. And the two pieces of who you are were inwardly sound and others focused. So when you talk about being others focused, we're preaching to the choir here around these things. But the statistical evidence to back up exactly what you just said, which this idea of having an others focused perspective or a servant leadership perspective, it doesn't only produce the great stories that you have seen and heard over the years at Chick-fil-A, but there's data that says that as well.
Our picture of leadership for more than 20 years has been an iceberg, close to 25 years now. And we say the 10% above the waterline represents the skills of the leader, and the 90% below, or I guess 77% based on your data, below the waterline, it's character. It's leadership character. And most leaders who fail, they fail because of character issues. It's not typically a skill gap, because you can Google how to have a good meeting. You can Google how to, build a good agenda. If you fail for those reasons, there are other things at play.
About 20 years ago, as I was getting started in my obsession with leadership, I was just being referred from one person to another, and I would end every qualitative conversation with, who else should I talk to? And one day somebody said, hey, you should call this person. And I called this leader at this organization, and he was super generous with his time. And I was probably hoping for 20 minutes, and I got an hour. And like a couple of weeks later, something showed up in the mail from this leader. It was a physical item that had to do with our conversation. And I was really struck by that. And it really, his generosity of time and even just randomly popping something in the mail to me, this kid who didn't know anything. Here's the other part of that story. That leader was you, Mark. 20 years ago, you took a phone call from me when I was just getting started. I didn't know which way was up, and you were so generous with your time with me. And it's people like you that spent time with me that I really appreciate. So 20 years later, I want to say thank you for spending an hour on the phone with me. That generosity where you're talking about with Truett Cathy, I experienced that generosity from you.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's my pleasure.
We'll talk about Chick-fil-A a little bit because obviously the brand is so well known. And some people know even some of the financial statistics. So as we talk about ideas like character qualities and why leaders succeed and fail, what the research says, what you have seen at Chick-fil-A, this idea that so much of it is below the surface, not necessarily the obviously seen stuff. But then we go to the statistics and we look at, if you add up McDonald's, Starbucks, and Subway, you're over $70 billion of revenue. But if you add up the revenue, and you know this story better than anybody, I'm sure, you add up the revenue per store, and those three combined don't reach the level of Chick-fil-A's revenue per store. So talk a little bit about, maybe help us connect the dots between the idea of being an others-focused leader and how that actually shows up in numbers like revenue and profitability.
Truett set the standard for us, and he modeled the generosity that we've been talking about. But one of his greatest contributions was his insight about the power of on-site leadership. And we have what we call our operator model. And these are women and men who run the restaurants. We own the restaurants, but they run the restaurant. So it's not a typical franchise. And why that matters as part of this conversation is that when we put up the cash, that reduces the requirement for cash on the part of the operator. So the pool of talent becomes enormous. I mean, they only put up $10,000 and $5,000 is refundable. So imagine that scenario as compared to if that operator, that would-be operator, if they had to buy the property or lease the property or build the building or get the equipment, as many of our competitors do. And that model works, but the pool of people who can do that and provide the leadership, it's very small. And so Truett had this insight decades ago. He said, if we put up the cash, we'll have this tremendous pool of talent to draw from. And so we have been able to recruit and select some amazing business leaders to operate the restaurants. And as a result, they recruit better and they hire better and they lead better and they engage better, and everything rises and falls on leadership. And we are just so fortunate to have those leaders in the restaurant. That's, I think, the linkage between the question you ask and our results. Tremendous on-site leadership.
The most profound things are often remarkably simple. And I never would have thought about the pool of talent that's available, but obviously if the key to open the door means you've got to have $2 million in the bank or whatever that requirement might be, then your pool is obviously significantly reduced. That's amazing and makes all kinds of sense. Now, you mentioned earlier the idea of cultivating this idea of serving leadership, others-focused leadership. And, inside that word cultivation is a worldview. It's an assumption that it's not just born, that we can do something either within ourselves or the other leaders we're developing. Talk a little bit about that, if you could, the idea that we can grow and develop leaders who over time become more others-focused.
Well, I think as with most of the significant decisions that we make in our lives, it begins with a choice. And if an individual leader says, I want to become more others focused, more others centered, that's half the battle. Because you mentioned that we're not born with it. I would argue we're born with the opposite. The world teaches us to look out for number one, to take care of ourselves. And so I think it's a lifelong process. I don't know that you ever arrive. I think that would be a dangerous place to be. But one of the very practical and extremely tactical activities that I personally practice, and I've been encouraging leaders for decades to do this, I said, what would happen if you attempted to add value to every person you encounter? Now, some listeners are immediately going, well, that's impossible. Well, hold on. You need to listen to exactly what I said. What would happen if you attempted to add value to every person you encounter? So if I'm trying to add value to you, who am I thinking about? Well, I'm now thinking about you. I'm not thinking about me. So my focus has already shifted. And there are countless ways to add value to people. But what changes you is not your success rate. What changes you is your effort. It's the trying that transforms. And so if I can add value to others, immediately shifting my focus. And so a fun story, I took a leadership assessment a few years back, and it was one of those real high-end ones, right? I mean, like where they have a consultant that comes and reviews your results with you. It's like, okay, I don't know how I ended up doing this, but this is great. And the guy walked in, and he looked like somebody had shot his cat or something. I mean, he had the longest face when he walked in the room. And I said, hey, are you okay? Because, I mean, it was like something was wrong with this guy. And I didn't know what it was, and I wanted to be really sensitive. And he said, well, let's talk. And I said, okay. And he kind of stuttered and stammered, and he said, it's about your survey. And I said, okay. And it's like he didn't want to have to tell me what he was going to tell me next. And he said, well, I don't know how to say this, but he said, based on the data, he said, when you walk in a room, you're not trying to be in charge. And I said, what's your point? He said, that's what leaders do. I said, not all leaders. That's not my objective. He said, what's your objective? I said, when I walk in a room, I'm trying to figure out how I can add value. And sometimes that's to be in charge, and sometimes that's to take out the trash. But he didn't have, and whoever wrote that survey didn't have that paradigm. Like they're going, you didn't check the box that said you want to be in charge. I said, well, no, I'm looking for a different box.
It's such a profound idea and something that as people are listening is actionable. Let's have people hear a little bit about how you're adding value to people these days.
I am still employed by Chick-fil-A. A lot of people ask me that question. I want to be sure all of my colleagues here at Chick-fil-A know, yes, I am still employed by Chick-fil-A. So that's my day job. And over the years, really for the last 25 years, I have been focused on trying to serve leaders. We realized over 2 decades ago that needed to be a priority for us. Specifically, how could we raise up and develop more leaders faster? And that was the initial charge back then. And so we've done a lot of work in the leadership development space over the last 25 years. And I would say our current mindset and model is to identify current or emerging challenges and try to figure out how we can add value. So a few years ago, we were working on the talent issue. We've worked on execution. We've worked on engagement. Most recently, we've been working on leadership effectiveness. We've got a project underway on culture. We've got another project underway around change management. So it's really trying to help our leaders and leaders around the world with those near-term emerging challenges.
That brings up an issue that a lot of people are dealing with right now. So do you want to call it the Great Reset or the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle? Talk a little bit about how this kind of COVID-induced Great Resignation, if you will, how has that impacted Chick-fil-A and how are you guys responding to that?
Well, from an operator and staff perspective, we've really not felt the effects of that. I will say that at the team member level, the talent market is tighter than I ever remember it being in my career. And there are probably any number of factors there. Being essential workers during COVID was really, really hard. And we have hundreds of thousands of team members that work for the operators around the chain. And you combine the difficulty of that work, the stress of that work, and the changing demographics in the world. And that talent pool is under stress and under duress. And so we have seen that as an issue. Now, as I pull back, I actually have a little bit of a different take on the Great Resignation. And I've read numerous articles on it, and I'm sure it's multifaceted. So let me say that up front. But most of the things I'm reading are putting a spin on it that it's men and women who have reflected during the pandemic and decided that they want to pursue a higher calling or higher purpose or more noble, whatever. And I actually think that's some of it. I think for many more people than we want to admit, it's exhaustion. It's just exhaustion. The work we just finished most recently was on leadership effectiveness. And we think so many leaders are in quicksand and that they're just exhausted because they're trying to swim in quicksand. And that's not sustainable. And they end up giving up. They end up quitting. And so we have spent a lot of time and energy thinking about how do you help leaders get out of quicksand so that if they choose to change careers or professions, that's fantastic. But I don't want folks to do that out of pain, anguish, and frustration.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that, and it gets back to the others-focused nature of who you are and who you're working to have your Chick-fil-A leaders be, because even as you say that, I hope some alarm bells are going off for people as they listen. I was like, wait a second, did he just talk about wanting to help people move on to the next job that they're going to do somewhere else, not exhausted, even though they're leaving Chick-fil-A? That is what you said, is it not?
Sure, but it's really aimed at the broader world because most of our Chick-fil-A people aren't leaving. We historically have about 96% retention of staff and operators, and that's decade over decade over decade over decade. And so thanks to the generosity and the abundance mentality of Chick-fil-A, we publish all of our research. So I'm actually optimistic that the things we've learned will probably prevent more of that resignation in the world than it will at Chick-fil-A. And now, keep in mind that leadership and management practices are at the sole discretion of independent operators. We've got over 2,000 of them. But many of them have that mindset that when someone leaves, they want them to leave for a better opportunity. I was with an operator, this has been a little while back, and I noticed on the name badges of his employees, it said future architect and future engineer and future teacher. And when they come into work, he asked them, what are their hopes and dreams? And he said, I'm going to help you get there. And he puts it on their name badges. So, we've got operators who have a real stewardship toward their people for sure.
Again, what a practical example. And I'm thinking if I'm that store operator and I have them put that on their name tag, it's also an accountability measure for me. What can I do? What am I doing to help besides paying you to be here? What can I do to encourage you towards that dream? Let's talk about this, if we could, that I got in the mail here recently. Mark's book, Smart Leadership. You talk about 4 key ideas in here, and I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the third one, fuel curiosity. But tell us a little bit about all 4 before we do that deeper dive, if you would.
As I mentioned, we saw a lot of leaders in quicksand, and this was pre-pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, we think it just got worse. A more toxic mix, more leaders sucked in. And so we were so thankful that we'd begun doing this work before things went crazy. And when you're in the quicksand, you can either give up, you die. And you may not physically die, but your hopes and your dreams and your aspirations, they're extinguished. Or you can try to swim in it, which is not sustainable, and you'll never do your best work. And there's so many leaders that are swimming in quicksand today. Or the third option is you escape. And so we shifted our focus to study the men and women who we felt like had become masters at staying out of quicksand. And if they ever found themselves in it, they would get out quickly. And we said, what can we learn from those folks that would be transferable to the rest of us? And we ultimately decided there are 4 choices that these leaders make consistently that enable them to stay out of the quicksand. The first choice is they confront reality, and there are strategies and tactics that we can all employ to do that better and more consistently. The second choice that smart leaders make is they grow capacity. which totally sounds counterintuitive. Most leaders in the quicksand would say, that's why I'm in quicksand, is I don't have enough capacity. It's like, okay, but if you want to get out, then you've got to choose to grow capacity. And again, we've got any number of strategies and tactics that will help leaders do that we've learned from leaders all over the world. The third choice is to fuel curiosity. And that's the one you said you wanted to go deep on. So we'll come right back to that. And then the fourth choice is the choice that it feels like, why do you even have to say this? But you have to choose to create change. There are so many leaders who'll make those first three choices and they're still in quicksand and they still struggle as leaders because they're unwilling or unable to create change. Some leaders, unfortunately, look at change as a burden. They look at it as an inconvenience. They look at it as an obstacle. They've lost the storyline. Change is our job as leaders. And for men and women who struggle with that, they're always going to struggle if they want to scale their impact and their effectiveness.
But one of the reasons why I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on fuel curiosity is when we talk about what does it mean to be an others-focused leader, one of the things that we talk about with our clients is being curious. And we talk about, there's intellectual curiosity, and you could read 1,000,001 HBR articles about that intellectual curiosity, which is important. But there's also this curiosity about people, about who they are and how they think and what their ideas are. And so this idea of fueling curiosity, whether it's within ourselves or within others, I thought it would be great to go a little bit deeper on that one. So unpack fuel curiosity a little bit for us, if you could.
So let me establish another word of context here. I've been asked in one form or another for decades the question, is there a leadership fountain of youth? And what I used to tell people is I hope so, because I'm looking for it. I feel like Ponce de Leon. I want to add value to my last breath. And so I hope there's a fountain of youth. Well, now I'm excited to tell people there is, and it's curiosity. It's how we maintain vitality in a dynamic world. It's how we demonstrate humility. We encourage and lift others. I mean, there are just so many advantages. The best leaders have always been learners. And I think our research validated what we probably already knew experientially and intuitively. But you got to make the choice. And then I will say this about all four of the choices. You got to make the choice, and then you got to make good on your choice. You have to activate the choice. You can say, I'm going to get fit. Okay, great. How are you going to do that? You're going to get a trainer, you're going to go to the gym, you're going to change your diet, you're going to start running. You actually have to do something. But it's preceded by a choice. And so I'm excited anytime a leader says, yes, I'm going to make the smart choice to fuel curiosity. I'm saying, fantastic. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And so in the book, we share a couple of best practices. One is to talk with strangers, which is really about curiosity conversations. And the other is ask, don't tell, which is about cultivating the art of questions as a lifestyle. And so those are the two best practices that we share in the book.
Let's start to finish out here. I want to talk about, as you look forward, here you are, number 16 ever hired employee in the corporate office of Chick-fil-A. This organization that I know there have been many other great leaders there as well, but you've been a part of that from very early on, unlike many others now in this $20 billion organization, and you were there from nearly the very beginning. You still have a future ahead of you. You spent all these years growing and developing leaders within Chick-fil-A. As you look at the next decade or so for yourself, what are some of your hopes and dreams and aspirations for this next 10 years for yourself?
Well, I want to continue to add value, and leaders, that's who I want to serve. I actually feel that my personal sense of calling, the reason I think I'm here is to encourage and equip leaders. And so over the next decade, I'm looking for for new ways to add value. I do anticipate that I'll continue writing. I've got several more book projects. I'll probably do more speaking. Obviously, much of my speaking now is chicken related, so I'll do more of that. And I have a team of young people trying to help me figure out social media. I mean, I would love to add value to 100 million leaders over the next decade. And they tell me it's possible. I just need to figure out what that looks like.
One of the things that's so obvious to me as we get a chance to visit today here, as I already knew of your generosity of spirit, but as we visit here today, it seems very obvious to me why you would be a really great person to do the very things that you're looking at over the next decade, because you are very, very clear on the leadership principles that you have to share, and you're a wonderful communicator about them. And that's all the cherry on top beneath the roots of that tree being really grounded in a variety of ideas, including being others focused.
Let me do two things. One is somebody's going to have a question. And so let me give you my cell number, and they can call or text 678-612-8441. And then if people are interested in a free Smart Leaders assessment, all they have to do is text Be Smart, one word, no space, Be Smart, to 66866. And I'm kind of excited about this. It's a little bit of an experiment, but you answer a few questions and then we send you a prescription of some things you can actually do based on your self-evaluation. So if that would serve anybody in your audience, you can pass that on.
What a wonderful opportunity it was to spend time with Mark Miller. And as we wrap up today, I want to emphasize a couple of things that Mark shared with us. The first one is this idea that when a leader enters the room, they have the mentality of, what value can I add? And I love the way he put it. He talked about the idea, perhaps the best way I add value is to take charge, or maybe the best way I add value is to take out the trash. And you've got the whole gamut between those two things. But that perspective that leading and influencing starts first with this idea of how can I add value to other people? And what if those of us who want to become better and better leaders, what if that's the mentality that we woke up with every day as we lead? The second thing that I want to point out that he shared with us is this idea. We talked about being others focused, and he emphasized that wanting to is half the battle. When I find a leader who wants to be others focused, that continually moves us in that direction. So if it sounds daunting or if it sounds impossible to every day be a leader who is more others focused than self-focused, if that sounds like a mountain that you can't climb, then I want you to be encouraged by what Mark said. I want you to be encouraged by the fact that just having an attitude of wanting to is a huge step towards being, becoming, and staying an others-focused leader. So this is the question I want to leave you with today. Are you attempting to be an others-focused leader? Before we close out this episode, I want to let you know about something that is coming on the Be Worth Following podcast. In our next episode, we are beginning a summer series called Who Not What, From Research to Application. In this series, we're going to dive deeply into the Who Not What principle. Now, while I've written extensively about who not what in the book, The Only Leaders Worth Following, I thought it would be fun to explore it here on the podcast. We'll start off by talking with the researcher who literally had her fingers on the computer keyboard when who not what was first discovered. We'll also talk with leaders who've applied who not what in global organizations as well as within themselves. I predict that you will get a ton of value by joining us for this series. Having said that, I'll sign off by reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.